I never imagined I'd be telling this story, but I feel like I have to. It still haunts me, and I hope it serves as a warning to others. If you're ever driving late at night through an isolated stretch of road, think twice before picking up a hitchhiker. You never know who or what you might be letting into your car. It all started about 2 years ago when I was on a long road trip across the country. I had some time off and decided to take a solo drive from New York down to Florida. I'd heard stories about long, empty stretches of highway, but nothing could prepare me for what happened. It was a cool autumn evening, and I was about 3 hours outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. The sun had just set, and the road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of asphalt. There weren't any streetlights, just the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the dark. There were no other cars around, just the occasional rustle of wind against the trees. I was tired, but I pushed on, knowing I still had a few more hours before I could find a place to stop. That's when I saw her. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a figure standing by the side of the road. But as I got closer, I could see it more clearly. She was a young woman, dressed in a long, tattered coat, her hair unkempt and wild. She was standing motionless, facing the road, her thumb out. Something about it didn't sit right with me. She was in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town or gas station. But the road had been so quiet, so desolate, that part of me almost welcomed the thought of human contact, even if it was with a stranger. I slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake, and rolled my window down a crack. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked, trying to gauge her reaction. She didn't answer at first. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes had a hollow, distant look to them. When she did speak, it was in a soft, barely audible voice. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her voice trembling. Normally, I would have just kept going, but something about her gave me pause. I don't know if it was the vulnerability in her voice or the way she looked, but I felt compelled to help. I told myself it was just a woman in need. It wasn't like I could leave her out there alone in the middle of nowhere. I unlocked the door, and she climbed in without saying a word. She didn't seem particularly grateful or relieved, just quiet. The atmosphere in the car immediately shifted, and I felt an unsettling chill, though the car's heater was running. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond. She simply stared out the window, her face pale and expressionless. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and I started to feel uncomfortable. It was then that I noticed something else strange. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I glanced over at her again, noticing how still she was. Her fingers were curled tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Something was off about her. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had a gut feeling that I was making a mistake by picking her up. Finally, I broke the silence. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. It was like she didn't even hear me. I repeated myself a little louder this time. I just need to get to the next town," she murmured, her voice faint. I nodded, though I had no idea where the nearest town was. It didn't matter. I just wanted to get her to safety, then be on my way. But as we continued down the road, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick, and the hum of the tires against the pavement was the only sound. I stole another glance at her, and that's when I saw it, the reflection of her face in the side mirror. She was looking at me, her eyes wide and staring directly at me. But her face wasn't quite right. Her mouth was slightly open, and I could swear I saw her lips curling into a twisted, unnatural smile. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly to look at her again. She hadn't moved, but the smile I saw in the mirror didn't match her expression now. Her face was expressionless once more, but the image of that twisted grin lingered in my mind. I tried to shake it off. I must have imagined it. But then the car's radio started to flicker. It had been working fine just minutes ago, but now the station was changing on its own. I reached to turn it off, but before I could, I heard a voice, low and distorted, coming through the static. "Why did you pick me up?" the voice asked, chillingly clear. I froze, my hand still hovering over the radio. I didn't know if I had heard that in my head or if it was real. The woman in the passenger seat didn't seem to react at all. I looked at her. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't even glance at me. She just continued to stare straight ahead. "Hello?" I asked again, this time louder. Her lips barely moved as she responded, "You shouldn't have stopped." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what to say. My instincts were screaming at me to pull over, let her out, and drive away as fast as I could. But there was something about her. Something about the way she was sitting there so still, so unnervingly calm, that kept me rooted to the spot. We continued driving in silence, but the air in the car was thick with tension. The radio began to flicker again, this time louder, more insistent, the distorted voice almost screaming now. "Turn around," the voice demanded. I was so terrified that I almost swerved off the road. I quickly turned the radio off and grabbed my phone to call for help, but the signal was completely dead. I looked at the woman in the seat beside me, and that's when I saw it. Her face had changed. Her once pale skin was now a sickly shade of gray, her eyes wide open, but lifeless. Her mouth stretched in that grotesque grin again, and her fingers twitched like they were about to reach out and grab me. "Get out of the car," I heard the voice say. "You're not going to make it." My hands shook as I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the road. I couldn't get out of there fast enough, but no matter how fast I drove, she was still there, sitting silently beside me, her eyes fixed on me as if she was waiting for something to happen. I don't remember how long I drove, but when I finally pulled into a gas station hours later, the woman was gone. I looked all around, but there was no sign of her. No footprints in the gravel, no lingering trace of her presence. It was like she had never existed at all. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe I picked up a ghost. Maybe I picked up something far worse. But the one thing I do know is that I'll never, ever pick up a hitchhiker again. I still drive late at night sometimes, but I avoid the long, desolate stretches of road now. And I always keep an eye on the side of the road, just in case. I hope no one else has to experience what I did.
Next story.
I should have never picked them up. It was late, a chilly autumn night. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of Appalachia, heading home from a business trip in a small town across the state. The roads were empty, and the air was thick with the kind of quiet you only get in rural places, the kind of silence that makes your mind wander into places it shouldn't go. I saw him first when I was about 10 miles from my exit. He was standing at the side of the road, thumb out, dressed in a long coat and a cowboy hat, looking like he had stepped out of a western. He was tall, too tall, and his face was obscured by the shadow of his hat. Something about the figure didn't sit right with me, but at that hour, you don't get many cars, and I wasn't heartless. Maybe he just needed a ride. As I slowed down and pulled over, my gut twisted. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a sense of dread crawl up my spine. It was more than just a stranger hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. It was the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He didn't hesitate. He opened the door, climbed in without a word, and just sat there, staring straight ahead. His eyes were hidden, and his silence was unnerving. I forced myself to break the tension with a simple, "Where are you headed?" His voice was deep, almost like gravel, but there was a strange hollowness to it, like he wasn't really there. "Doesn't matter," he said, his eyes still not meeting mine. "Just keep driving." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I did as he asked. The road stretched ahead of us, the only sound being the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Every now and then I would glance at him from the corner of my eye, but he didn't move. He didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared into the darkness outside the window, as if he was waiting for something. My thoughts started to race, and the car felt smaller with each passing mile. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see another vehicle tailing us, but the road remained empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, but whenever I looked, nothing was there. "You all right?" I finally asked, trying to break the growing tension. He didn't respond, not immediately at least. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned his head slowly, just enough for his eyes to meet mine. But the look in them wasn't right. It wasn't human. His pupils were dilated, black as night, and there was something hollow about his gaze, something that made my skin crawl. I should have turned the car around, I know. I should have found the nearest exit and left him behind. But I didn't. I kept driving. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice raspy like he hadn't used it in years. "No," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just passing through." He chuckled, a low, dry sound. "You shouldn't be out here alone. You don't know what's out here." I didn't like the way he said that. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, but I kept my eyes on the road. Why don't you tell me? I tried to sound confident, but even I knew it came out shakier than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the windshield, as if looking for something in the distance. The headlights of the car illuminated the trees lining the road, casting long, twisted shadows on the pavement. They say the road calls to you, he said finally, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. The road never forgets, you know. It takes what it wants. At that moment, a cold shiver ran down my spine, and I regretted picking him up. I should have just driven past. Look, I'm just trying to get home, I said, my voice trembling. Can you just tell me where you're going? He turned his head toward me again, and the look in his eyes was pure malice. Home? Is that what you think? You're not going home. Not anymore. His words didn't make sense. It was like he was talking in riddles, and I couldn't understand what he meant. The feeling of unease was thick in the car now. The silence was deafening. My eyes flicked back to the road, but it felt like the trees were closing in on us, like the darkness itself was reaching for the car. And then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life. The static was harsh, the sound a low, mournful whine, and for a second, I thought I might have imagined it. But then came the voice. A woman's voice. "Turn back," she said, her voice cold and distant. "He's not who you think he is." I froze. I wasn't imagining it. I looked at the hitchhiker, but he didn't seem to notice the voice. His expression was unchanged, eyes fixed ahead as if nothing had happened. But I could feel something changing. The air was different now, thicker, like I was driving through a fog that wasn't there. Who? Who was that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, his lips curled into a strange, unsettling grin. "You should have listened to her," he said softly. Suddenly, the temperature in the car dropped. I could see my breath fogging up the windshield, and the warmth of the heater seemed to fade away. The shadows around us deepened, and the road ahead of us seemed to twist, as if the pavement was bending in unnatural ways. I knew something terrible was about to happen. The hitchhiker's hand reached out, resting on the dashboard, his fingers impossibly long and pale. He wasn't human. No part of him was. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. I turned to look at him, but the seat was empty. He was gone. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked around, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The road was deserted again. The trees swayed in the wind, and everything was eerily quiet. I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too afraid to even start the car again. The air felt heavy, like I was being watched. Slowly, I reached for the door handle and opened it, my body trembling. The night air bit at my skin as I stepped out of the car, looking around frantically. But there was nothing. No sign of the man. Nothing but the empty road stretching on forever. I wanted to run, to get away from that place, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt as if I was paralyzed, my body refusing to listen to my mind. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl from behind me. I spun around, and there he was, standing in the middle of the road, staring at me with those black, hollow eyes. He was closer now, too close, and the look on his face, it wasn't a human expression anymore. It was a twisted mask of rage and something far worse. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. I didn't wait to hear more. I jumped back into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off down the road, not daring to look back. My heart was racing, and I could hear the sound of my breath in my ears as I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. I drove for what seemed like hours, not stopping, not even slowing down. The road blurred in front of me, and I couldn't tell if I was seeing things or if it was just my mind playing tricks. But I could still feel his presence, like he was there, just beyond the edge of my vision. When I finally reached the nearest town, I didn't even stop for gas. I drove straight to the motel, booked a room, and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black eyes staring at me from the darkness. The next morning, I told the motel clerk what happened. She didn't even blink. "He's been around for years," she said, like it was nothing. "You're not the first to tell a story like that." I left that town as fast as I could, never looking back. But I know the truth now. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. Some hitchhikers aren't meant to be picked up. And some things, they never leave you.
Next story.
It was the kind of night that made you wish you were somewhere else. I had just finished a late shift at the hospital. The night had been long, the kind of busy night that made you question your choice of career, but I was used to it. The city was a blur of flashing lights and tired faces as I climbed into my old car and headed home. I decided to take the back roads, avoiding the highway to save time. It wasn't much longer, and the winding country roads had a kind of quiet that I found comforting after the chaos of the ER. I was alone, just me and the road. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the occasional deer or stray dog wandering near the edge. My mind was foggy from exhaustion, but something in the air felt off. I couldn't explain it, but there was an unease hanging over me. I had driven maybe 15 minutes when I saw him, a figure standing by the side of the road near a curve. His silhouette was barely visible in the dim light, but I could see enough to know he was tall, dressed in dark clothes. His hand was raised, thumb out, hitchhiking. I don't know why, but I slowed down. Maybe it was the isolation, the stretch of empty road ahead, or just my own guilty conscience for passing someone by. But I stopped. He didn't speak at first as he climbed into the passenger seat. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat, and his clothes were a bit tattered, but he didn't look desperate. There was something otherworldly about him. "You need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed a hint of discomfort. He didn't answer right away. I glanced at him. His skin was pale and his hands were long and thin, almost too thin. Finally, he turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes were pitch black, no whites, no color, just dark voids that seemed to absorb the light. It took everything in me not to swerve off the road. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice low and raspy. "I've been waiting a long time." I nodded, too stunned to speak, trying to keep my eyes on the road. The hair on the back of my neck was standing on end, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him to get out. Something about him, about this moment, felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I needed to keep driving. We didn't speak for a long while. The silence in the car was suffocating. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of his coat as he shifted slightly in his seat. I glanced at him again, but he was staring out the window, his face expressionless. The darkness outside seemed to press in closer, and the trees lining the road began to feel like they were too near, almost as if they were watching us. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, its static cutting through the silence. I froze. The voice that came through the airwaves wasn't a DJ, wasn't a program. It was just a voice, soft but distinct. "Turn back," it whispered. "Don't listen to him." I almost slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the hitchhiker. He hadn't moved, his eyes still fixed on the window, but his lips were smiling. The smile didn't match his eyes, and it chilled me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. The smile faded. "You're just tired," he said, his voice smooth, almost soothing. "There's nothing wrong, nothing to worry about." But there was something wrong. Everything about him screamed wrong. His eyes were too dark, his skin too pale, and his presence was oppressive, like the air around me was suffocating, pressing in on all sides. I tried to focus on the road, my hands white-knuckling the steering wheel, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease creeping through my veins. The road ahead seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if the distance between me and safety was growing further with every passing second. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the suffocating tension. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned slowly toward me, and this time, when I looked into his eyes, it was like staring into a void. His pupils were so dark they seemed to absorb everything around them. "A long way," he said softly. "A place far beyond your reach." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The air in the car grew colder, and I could see my breath in the rearview mirror, even though the heater was on full blast. I wanted to ask more, but before I could, the car jerked to a halt. I hadn't touched the brakes. My heart skipped a beat. The road ahead was now completely different. The trees, the houses I'd passed a few miles ago, the sign for the next town, all gone. Instead, I was staring at a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, stretching out into an empty black void. "What's happening?" I gasped, trying to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The engine made a faint sputtering sound and then died completely. The hitchhiker didn't react. He just sat there, still as stone, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've reached your destination," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I looked around frantically. The world outside the car had transformed into a black, featureless expanse. There was no sky, no horizon, just a void, an endless abyss stretching out before me. "Get out," he said. I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? What is this?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door, and before I could protest, he stepped out as if he belonged to the darkness outside. I sat frozen in the car, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the door handle, but the door wouldn't open. I tried the windows, but they were sealed shut. The air inside was thick, stifling, and as I turned to look back at him, he was no longer in front of me. He was standing at the edge of the road, still looking at me, his dark eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I could hear him, though he hadn't moved his lips. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. "Forever." I slammed my hand against the window, the sound muffled in the confined space. "No! Please, help me." But there was no help, there was no one. Only the darkness, the infinite road, and the man with the black eyes who was now coming closer, step by slow step. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I don't know if I passed out or if time simply stopped, but when I opened my eyes again, the car was moving again. I was back on the road, the same road I'd been on before. No void, no hitchhiker. But I could feel him watching me, even now wherever I go. The next day, I drove through the same stretch of road, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker, no trace of him. The world seemed to have returned to normal, except that it hasn't. I can still feel his eyes on me. No matter where I am, the voice still echoes in my mind. Some roads I've learned are never truly left behind.
Next story.
I'll never forget that night. It was a cool, crisp evening in late October. The kind of night where the air smells like falling leaves, and you can almost feel the weight of the moon watching you. I had just finished a long day of work, and after being on the road all day, I was eager to get home. The sun had set hours ago, and the streets were nearly deserted. I was driving on a long stretch of highway, the kind that seems to go on forever, with no other cars in sight. I always hated those stretches, especially when it was late. The isolation made the road feel like it was never ending. It was one of those moments where your mind starts to wander and you feel like you're the only person left on Earth. Out of nowhere, I saw something on the side of the road. It was a person, standing in the dark. I couldn't make out much at first, but it looked like a young woman dressed in a long coat, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was waving her arm up and down, signaling for a ride. I hesitated. It was a bad idea, I knew it. You hear all these stories about hitchhikers and the dangers that come with picking them up. But then I thought about it. Maybe she needed help. The night was cold, and she looked like she had been out there for a while. I couldn't just drive by. Maybe it was my instincts telling me to stop, or maybe it was guilt, but I pulled over to the shoulder. The moment I stopped, she approached the car quickly. I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to hear her, but not enough to let her too close. "Can I get a ride?" she asked, her voice shaky and soft. I looked at her more closely. She didn't seem to have a bag or anything with her, and there were no cars around for miles. It was strange. Still, I didn't want to be rude. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to gauge if she was harmless. She gave me a brief, almost too vague answer. "Just up the road. I'm trying to get home." I hesitated for a moment, the weight of caution hanging in the air. But I couldn't leave her out there. I unlocked the door. "Hop in." She slid into the passenger seat quickly, almost eagerly. The moment she shut the door, an uncomfortable chill settled in. It wasn't just the cold night air, it was something else. Something off. I gave her a glance as I pulled back onto the highway. She was just staring out the window, her face expressionless. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she didn't speak a word. I tried to break the silence. "Where are you coming from?" She didn't answer at first. I almost thought she hadn't heard me, but then she spoke softly. "I don't want to talk about it." That was when I noticed the strange feeling creeping into my chest. Her voice was odd, too soft, almost detached, like she wasn't really there. We drove in silence for a while. The only sounds were the hum of the tires against the road and the occasional rustle of the wind. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but it kept gnawing at me. It wasn't her appearance per se, but more her behavior. I kept glancing over at her, but she never turned to look at me. It was as if she was in her own world, not really aware of anything around her. Then, without any warning, she spoke again, her voice as cold as the air outside. "Do you ever wonder what's out there in the dark?" I didn't know how to respond. My heart skipped a beat and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned her head slowly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her pupils were dilated as if she hadn't seen daylight in weeks. She looked almost vacant. "I mean," she continued, "there are things out there, things that follow people, things that wait for the right moment to strike." I wasn't sure if she was just trying to scare me, but something in her tone made me shiver. I thought about telling her to stop talking, to just stay quiet, but I couldn't get the words out. It felt like my mouth was dry, like I was being paralyzed by some invisible force. I forced myself to focus on the road, but the feeling of unease kept growing. I could hear her breathing beside me, steady, almost too steady. And then I heard something else. It was faint at first, just a whisper, a distant sound that I couldn't make out. I kept driving, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. The whisper grew louder, and I realized it was coming from her. She was muttering something under her breath, words I couldn't understand. I glanced at her again, and her face was almost unrecognizable. It wasn't just the emptiness in her eyes, it was the way her mouth moved, as if she was speaking a language I couldn't comprehend. I was terrified. "Stop," I said, my voice shaky. "Please, just stop talking." But she didn't stop. Her muttering only got louder, more frantic, until I could hear it clearly. "Help me. Help me. It's too late. They're already here." At that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like I was suffocating, like something heavy was pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I struggled to focus, to keep my grip on the wheel, but everything around me seemed to blur. I heard the whisper growing louder, and then I saw something in the corner of my eye, something that shouldn't have been there. There, in the darkness of the road, was a figure. A silhouette, standing just beyond the edge of my headlights, watching us. My hands tightened on the wheel. I tried to keep my focus, but I couldn't stop looking at it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could name. It was just a shadow, an outline of something too dark to comprehend. And then the whisper stopped. "Do you see it?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper itself. She was staring straight ahead, her face twisted in a way that didn't look human anymore. Her eyes, those eyes were fixated on the figure outside. I didn't respond. My throat was dry, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there, but the road felt endless. I felt trapped, like the car was no longer mine, like I was just a passenger along for the ride. The figure outside moved. It wasn't a man, wasn't a woman, wasn't human at all. It shifted in the darkness, flickering like a broken light bulb, never fully appearing. I couldn't tell if it was getting closer, but it didn't matter. I had to get away. Without thinking, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, speeding faster than I had intended, but I didn't care. I didn't look back. I just wanted to be gone from that road, away from whatever was out there. The girl beside me didn't even flinch as I sped away. She didn't say another word. In fact, she was gone. 1 minute, she was sitting there beside me, and the next, she wasn't. I didn't stop the car until I reached a gas station. I rushed inside, heart racing, trying to get some semblance of normality back. I asked the attendant if there had been any sign of the hitchhiker I picked up, but he just stared at me like I was crazy. There were no reports of anyone matching her description, and no one had seen anything strange out there. I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was real or just some twisted illusion. But I can tell you this, I never picked up another hitchhiker again.
Next story.
I had always been skeptical about ghost stories, always chalking them up to overactive imaginations or exaggerations. But that all changed the night I picked up the hitchhiker. It's a story I don't like to tell, but it's been haunting me ever since. I think about it almost every night when I drive home late from work, and I can never shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It was a late October night, just days before Halloween. I was driving down a stretch of road in rural Texas, heading home after a long, exhausting day at the office. It was about 2 a.m., and I was completely alone on the road. The sky was clear, the moon casting an eerie glow over the asphalt, but the only sounds I could hear were the hum of my tires on the road and the occasional whoosh of wind. The nearest town was miles away, and there was nothing but open land for as far as the eye could see. As I rounded a sharp bend, I saw a figure up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a mirage. It was far too late for anyone to be out here, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing by the side of the road, holding his thumb out in the universal sign for a ride. I didn't want to stop. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. It was way too late for someone to be out here alone, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that he might be in trouble, and I wasn't the type of person to ignore someone in need. So I slowed down and pulled over beside him. I rolled down my window just a crack. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding almost too loud in the silence of the night. The man's face was partially obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I could see enough to know he was older, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. He had a scruffy beard and a disheveled look, his clothes tattered and dirty. His eyes were hidden in the shadows, but I could see his lips move as he spoke. "Yeah," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "I'm trying to get to the next town." I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to drive away, but I ignored them. "All right, hop in," I said, unlocking the door. The man climbed into the passenger seat without a word, and I immediately regretted my decision. The air in the car seemed to grow colder, and the silence between us was suffocating. I could feel his eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look over at him. After a few minutes, I decided to break the silence. "So where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He didn't answer at first. I glanced over at him and saw that he was staring out the window, his face expressionless. It was as if he hadn't heard me at all. I repeated the question, a little louder this time. "Just a few more miles," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, but the conversation didn't continue. The air between us grew heavier with each passing minute. The radio in my car began to crackle, the static growing louder. I reached over to turn it off, but as I did, I noticed something strange. The man was no longer sitting still. His fingers were twitching nervously on his lap, his legs bouncing up and down. He was fidgeting as if he was uncomfortable. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward me. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and the whites of his eyes were bloodshot, almost glowing in the dim light of the car. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I met his gaze. "Where are you going?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp and demanding. I was taken aback. "I'm just heading home," I replied, my voice faltering. He leaned in closer, his breath hot on my face. "Home?" he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Do you know what's waiting for you there?" I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. His voice, his presence, it was all wrong. I quickly looked away, focusing on the road ahead, but I could still feel his eyes burning into me. The car seemed to grow colder by the second. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness behind me. No other cars, no lights, just blackness. Suddenly, the man's voice broke the silence again, but this time it wasn't in the same tone. It was distorted, low, almost guttural. "Turn around," he growled, his voice echoing in my ears. I froze. "What?" "Turn around," he repeated, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the car. "You shouldn't have stopped." I wasn't sure if he was playing some kind of sick joke, but I didn't want to find out. I was scared in a way I'd never been before. The temperature in the car had dropped so much that I could see my breath fogging up in the air, despite the heater blasting. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the road. I whipped my head around to tell him to get out, but when I looked at the passenger seat, he was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. The seat was empty, the door still locked, the air in the car still freezing cold. I don't remember how long I sat there, stunned and terrified, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But when I finally regained control of my senses, I started the car and sped off, my heart racing as I drove down the road faster than I ever had before. The rest of the drive was a blur, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every shadow seemed to move, every passing car seemed to watch me, and I could swear I saw the reflection of that man in every window I passed. When I finally made it home, I rushed inside, locking all the doors behind me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those bloodshot eyes, that twisted grin, that voice telling me I shouldn't have stopped. It's been a year since that night, but I still feel like he's out there, waiting for me. I haven't picked up a hitchhiker since, and I never will again. No one should have to experience what I did. And if you ever find yourself driving down an empty stretch of road late at night and you see a man standing there, don't stop. Because sometimes the people who need a ride aren't just looking for a lift. They're looking for something much, much worse.
Next story.
It was just a regular Thursday night when it happened. I was driving home from a late shift at the restaurant, my mind already drifting to the warm bed I'd soon be lying in. The roads were quiet, the kind of quiet where the only sounds you hear are your tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of the wind. I had just turned onto a rural stretch of highway, the kind of road that doesn't have streetlights for miles. As I passed the familiar landmarks, the old barn, the crooked tree, the sign for a town that I would never stop in, I saw him. A man standing off to the side of the road, a thumb outstretched as if waiting for a ride. I didn't want to stop. I mean, you hear the stories. Hitchhikers have a bad reputation, and I had no intention of being the next headline. But there was something about him. He wasn't frantic, didn't seem to be in any sort of distress. He just stood there. For some reason, I slowed down. As I came closer, he stepped toward the car, still staring at the ground, his thumb still out. He didn't look up until I was almost beside him. Then he raised his eyes, and that's when I froze. His eyes weren't normal. They were wide, almost unblinking, and the pupils were unnaturally dark, like voids that swallowed up the light. But they weren't what froze me. It was the expression on his face, or the lack of one. His face was like a mask, completely blank. His mouth didn't move when he spoke, but I heard him clearly. "Can you help me?" His voice was deep, distorted, as though it didn't belong to him. It vibrated through me in a way I can't explain, something that felt wrong. I should have driven away. Every part of my brain screamed at me to drive away, but my hands betrayed me. My foot lifted off the gas pedal. Without thinking, I pulled over. The man opened the door before I could even reach the handle. He slid into the passenger seat with an unsettling grace. His movements were smooth, almost too smooth, like he didn't have to think about them. "Thank you," he said, the same unnerving voice, now calm, almost too calm. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the growing tension in the air. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was fixed on the window. I stole glances at him, trying to figure out what was wrong. But the more I looked, the more I felt like I was missing something. "You're not from around here, are you?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He didn't answer immediately. Then, when he did speak, his voice was like a whisper against the night. "I've been here longer than you think." I frowned. "What do you mean?" But he didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, so thick I could almost feel it pressing against me. I was nervous now. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something was off, and I knew it. I could feel his eyes on me, even though he wasn't looking at me. We drove for what felt like hours. The headlights of the car illuminated the road, but it felt like the darkness was closing in around us, swallowing up the world outside. And that's when I noticed it. The shadows. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the trees, but the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't normal shadows. They were moving, swaying just beyond the reach of the headlights, like they were alive. I blinked and looked away, hoping I was imagining it, but when I looked back, they were still there. The shadows stretched toward the car, reaching out, twisting as if they were trying to pull us in. I couldn't take it anymore. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice a little too shaky. He didn't answer. I glanced at him again. His face was still blank, but his eyes, those eyes were now fixed on me, unblinking, wide, watching me. There was no emotion, no expression, just a deep, unsettling emptiness. And then I heard it. A sound, low and distant, coming from behind us. It wasn't the sound of another car or any animal I recognized. It was something else, something heavy. It grew louder, closer, and I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty, but the sound continued, growing louder with every passing second, getting closer as though something was chasing us, something large, something that didn't belong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart raced. I wanted to scream, to ask him what was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I turned back to the road, my eyes darting to the shadows, which were now closer, moving faster, growing larger as if they were racing us. It felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. I wasn't driving anymore. The car was driving itself. I wasn't in control. The man in the passenger seat was still silent, but I felt him watching me, his gaze burning into me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then it stopped. The sound, the shadows, the pull of the car, they all vanished in an instant. I looked around in a daze. The road was back to normal. The trees, the signs, everything was as it should be. The darkness no longer felt so oppressive. I could hear the sound of the wind again. I glanced at the passenger seat. The man was gone. The door was still closed, and the seat was empty. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but then I noticed something. On the seat, where he had been sitting, was a dark, wet stain, almost like something had leaked out of him, something that shouldn't be there. I touched it, and it was cold, but it felt wrong, like it wasn't part of this world. I didn't stop to think. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the road, barely noticing the miles flying by. When I finally reached home, I didn't even bother to park. I just left the car running in the driveway and ran inside. I locked all the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in the corner of the living room, too terrified to even move. It wasn't until the next morning that I got the courage to go outside. I was hoping, praying, that it had all been some strange dream, some trick my mind had played on me. But when I checked the car, there was no mistaking it. The wet stain was still there. It hadn't dried, and it hadn't faded. It was like it was waiting for me to see it, to remember it. The stain was in the shape of something human. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what that man was or what those shadows were. But every time I think about it, I feel that same cold, that same emptiness, like I'm being watched, like something is waiting for me to go back to that road. And the worst part, sometimes when I drive past that stretch of highway, I swear I see him again, standing at the side of the road, his thumb raised, waiting. And I know deep down that if I ever stop again, it might be the last thing I ever do.
Next story.
It was a stormy night, one of those rare kinds of storms that seem to come out of nowhere, quickly turning the sky from clear to black. I was on my way home, driving through the back roads of New Hampshire, trying to get back before the worst of it hit. The rain came down in sheets, pelting the windshield in such a way that I could barely see the road ahead of me. The wind howled, pushing my car to the side as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep control. It was late, too late for anyone else to be out. The only other lights on the road came from the occasional flash of lightning. Everything else was swallowed up by the storm. And then, through the darkness, I saw something that made my heart race. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the rain or my headlights, but as I got closer, I saw it clearly. There, standing by the side of the road in the pouring rain, was a figure, a woman. She was soaked through, her clothes clinging to her body as she stood motionless, staring straight ahead. I almost didn't stop. Something about the scene felt off, wrong even, but my conscience wouldn't let me pass by. It was a small, quiet town, and there was no way anyone would be out here unless they needed help. So I slowed down, rolling my window down a crack. "Hey," I called out. "Are you all right? Do you need a ride?" She didn't respond at first, just stood there, her head slightly tilted as if she hadn't heard me. The rain poured over her, but she didn't seem to be bothered by it. The silence stretched on, and I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. I was about to drive away when she finally moved. She turned toward me, her face pale, eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Desperation? The kind of expression that made my gut twist. And then she spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "Please, I need to get home." I hesitated for a moment, but then I unlocked the door and she climbed in without a word. There was something about her that felt off, too quiet, too still, but I pushed the feeling aside. She was just a woman caught in the storm, right? I turned the heat up, hoping to make her more comfortable. "Where do you live?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She didn't answer. She just stared out the window, her face still pale, her eyes unfocused, as if lost in thought. I glanced over at her, expecting to see some sign of gratitude or relief, but instead, she just sat there as if she was trapped in her own world. The rain slammed against the roof of the car, and the wind howled louder, the storm growing more intense by the minute. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked over at her again. Her hair was drenched, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't moved since she got in. "Where do you need to go?" I asked again, my voice more insistent this time. She finally turned to look at me, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, almost like she was afraid to speak too loudly. "Please, take me home," she said. I frowned. "I can't just take you anywhere. You need to tell me where you live. What's your address?" The woman blinked slowly as if she hadn't heard me. "Home is far away," she muttered. I was starting to get frustrated. The air in the car was thick with tension. "Look, I can't drive around aimlessly in this storm. Tell me where to go." Her lips parted as if she was going to speak again, but just as she did, there was a flash of lightning so bright it illuminated the whole car. It only lasted a second, but in that instant, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw the woman's face change. It wasn't a trick of the light. I saw her smile, but it wasn't a smile of relief or gratitude. It was a twisted, unnatural grin, one that made her eyes look hollow and dark. I couldn't breathe. I turned to look at her, but when I did, the smile was gone, replaced with the same pale, distant expression she had worn when she first got in. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she just stared at me, those wide eyes never blinking. I felt a chill in the air, like a cold breeze had swept through the car, though the windows were closed tight. The atmosphere had changed, and I could feel it. The heaviness, the dread. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. I could no longer hear the storm outside. It was like the world had gone silent. A few more miles passed in silence, but then without warning, she spoke again, her voice low and cold. "You're going the wrong way." I slammed on the brakes, skidding on the wet pavement. "What do you mean the wrong way? You said to take you home." She turned her head slowly to look at me. "You're not taking me home," she said softly. "You can't." A sick feeling washed over me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "What do you mean? What do you want from me?" The woman's gaze remained fixed on me, and in that moment I realized something. I couldn't remember how she had gotten in the car. I couldn't remember hearing her open the door or even seeing her get in. Had she just appeared? Before I could say anything, she reached out and placed a cold hand on my shoulder. "I need to go home," she whispered, her voice turning sharp, almost pleading. "But I can't go alone." The temperature in the car plummeted. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned to look at her again, and her face was different. No longer pale and distant, but twisted, distorted, with dark shadows under her eyes. Her once wet hair had dried into a mass of tangled, matted strands. And her eyes, they weren't human anymore. They were black, empty, devoid of any trace of life. I screamed, slamming the car into gear, my foot on the gas, and I sped off fast as I could, never looking back. The rain was falling harder than ever, and the wind whipped through the trees, but all I could think about was getting away from her. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a gas station and locked the doors. The woman was gone. I never saw her again, but I still feel her presence every time I drive through that stretch of road. And to this day, I wonder, was she real, or was she something else? Something trapped between worlds, looking for someone to help her find her way home.
Next story.
It was a quiet night in the small town of Ashford, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. I had just moved to the area a few weeks ago, hoping for a fresh start. The air was crisp, and the trees had begun to shed their leaves in preparation for winter. My house sat at the edge of town, on a stretch of road that seemed to be forgotten by time. There were no streetlights, no neighbors for miles. Just me, the trees, and the never-ending silence of the countryside. One evening, I was coming back from town after running some errands, the sun long gone, the only light coming from my car's headlights. As I rounded the bend near my house, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, her silhouette barely visible in the fading light. I slowed the car down instinctively, not thinking much of it. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she needed help. It was a small town, and people helped each other out. I wasn't going to be the one to ignore someone in need. As I got closer, I could see more details. She was standing motionless, her back to me. Her long, dark hair was swaying slightly in the wind, and she was wearing a long, white dress that seemed too clean for someone who might have been walking for a long time. I couldn't see her face, but there was something about her posture that made me uneasy. She didn't even turn to look at me as I drove by, which struck me as odd. I drove past her, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important. My foot hovered over the brake as I tried to brush off the thought. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but before I knew it, I found myself looking in the rearview mirror. The woman had turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty. She was staring directly at me, her expression blank, unblinking, as if she had known I would look. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I did the only thing I could think of. I pressed the gas pedal harder and drove away, the tires kicking up dirt behind me. I didn't stop at the house right away. I drove aimlessly for a while, my heart racing, my thoughts a mess. I tried to convince myself I had just been tired, maybe seeing things. But when I finally pulled up to my house, I couldn't shake the image of her eyes from my mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a soft tapping sound against my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as the tapping continued, I realized it was something else. Deliberate, rhythmic, like someone was knocking. I froze in place. The sound didn't stop. It was persistent, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the window. I could see nothing outside, only the darkness of the trees and the quiet stillness of the night. But the tapping was still there. I pulled the blinds down and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I couldn't understand why I felt so terrified. It wasn't like I had seen anything, but I knew something was wrong. Something was out there. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the property, trying to convince myself that it was just my nerves getting the best of me. The day was calm, almost unnervingly so. I walked along the path behind the house that led into the woods, trying to calm my thoughts. That was when I saw something strange in the distance. A figure standing in the woods. It wasn't the woman from the night before, but it was someone, or something, that didn't belong. The figure was tall, thin, and covered in tattered clothing, its face obscured by a dark hood. It stood motionless, facing the woods as though waiting for something, or someone. I stood frozen, watching it for a moment, before instinct took over, and I turned to walk back to the house. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I hurried back to the house, locking all the doors behind me. It wasn't until later that night that I heard the tapping again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the front door. I stood in the hallway, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. But the tapping continued, growing louder and faster. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there was desperate to get in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the voice. It was faint at first, almost a whisper, but then it grew stronger, clear and distinct. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but there was something oddly familiar about it. A woman's voice, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside a hollow place. I stepped back, my mind racing. I knew I had to do something. I wasn't going to open the door, but I needed to know what was out there. I crept to the window and peeked outside, and there she was, the woman from the road. But now she was closer, standing right in front of the door, her face contorted in an eerie grin, her eyes wide and empty, just like before. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared at me, waiting. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, and my heart hammered in my chest. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I was trapped, alone, with nowhere to run. I had no idea what she wanted, what she was, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let her in. For hours, I waited, but the woman didn't leave. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The night passed, and when the first rays of light peeked through the curtains, I dared to look again. She was gone. The next morning, I went outside, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But there, in the dirt near the front porch, was something that made my stomach drop. A set of footprints leading from the woods and stopping at my door. They were wet, as though something had been dragging its feet through the mud, leaving a trail that ended right where the woman had stood. I never saw her again after that night, but I know she's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the right time to come back. And sometimes when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the tapping. It's waiting for me to answer.
Next story.
I had always loved long drives, especially on quiet, deserted highways. There's something about the road stretching out in front of you with no other cars around that gives you a sense of freedom. I had driven this particular route many times, heading home from a weekend with friends. The road was long, winding, and mostly empty, and it was the perfect place to get lost in your own thoughts. At least that's what I thought before that night. It was late, about 1:30 a.m., and I was about an hour from home. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the only light I had was from my car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The only sound was the tires humming along the pavement, and the occasional rustle of the wind as it passed through the trees lining the road. I hadn't seen another car for what felt like an eternity when I noticed something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. I squinted, trying to make out any details. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could tell it was a person. They weren't waving or signaling for a ride, just standing there, motionless. Now, I know the rules. Hitchhiking is dangerous. I had been told all my life not to pick up strangers, especially late at night. But in that moment, I was torn. The figure looked like they were in distress, perhaps stranded or needing help. Maybe I could just stop and offer assistance, even if I didn't let them in the car. I slowed down as I approached, my mind racing with what I should do. As I got closer, I saw more details. The person was a man, maybe in his mid-30s, dressed in a dark jacket, jeans, and boots. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, almost too wide, like he hadn't blinked in a long time. There was something unsettling about his stillness. He didn't move a muscle, not even when I rolled down my window. "Hey," I called out, my voice tentative. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. He just stared at me with those unblinking eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm, but something about it didn't sound right. It was as if his words were forced, unnatural. "I need a ride," he said, his lips barely moving. I hesitated. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just down the road," he replied, a faint, eerie smile creeping across his face. I didn't like the way he said it. It was too vague, too impersonal. I glanced down the road, but it was as empty and dark as ever. There was no town in sight, no gas station, no house, nothing but trees and shadows stretching out for miles. "I'm sorry," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "I can't pick you up. You should call someone for help." The man's smile faltered for just a moment, and I saw a flash of something. Anger, maybe? His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I felt like I was looking at something other than a human being. Something darker, colder, more sinister. Then, just as suddenly, he smiled again, and it felt like the temperature in the car dropped several degrees. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice now almost a whisper. "I really need a ride." I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I looked at him for one more second, then quickly slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding away from him without another word. As I drove, I could see him in the rearview mirror, standing motionless in the same spot, watching me disappear into the night. I didn't dare look away from the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I was shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about his face, his eyes, that smile. Something about it felt off. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had made the right choice by not picking him up. I drove for what felt like hours, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see him there, following me. But after a while, the darkness seemed to swallow the road around me, and I couldn't see anything behind me. It was like I was the only person left in the world. Then, just as I was starting to relax a little, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way it could be the same man, right? I hadn't seen any other cars for miles. But there he was again, standing exactly where I had just passed him, as if he had never moved. I slowed down, my hands shaking. I couldn't take my eyes off him. The same pale face, the same wide eyes, the same eerie, knowing smile. But this time, he was standing much closer to the center of the road, almost as if he was waiting for me. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to drive faster, to leave him behind, but something in the back of my mind told me that if I didn't stop, he might follow me again. My foot hovered over the brake, and then before I could make any decision, he vanished. One moment, he was standing there, and the next, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. I couldn't believe my eyes. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still shaking. I looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of him, no footprints, no shadows, nothing. It was like the entire encounter had never happened. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I had just seen. I had never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but now I wasn't so sure. How could someone be in two places at once? How could they just vanish like that? I finally gathered enough courage to keep driving. I didn't look in the rearview mirror again. I didn't want to see him there. I didn't want to even think about him. But as I neared my exit and finally made my way into town, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A news story flashed across the local TV station as I passed a gas station. The headline was about a hitchhiker who had been spotted on the same stretch of road I had just driven on, a man who had been reported missing over a decade ago. The eerie smile, the wide eyes, the feeling of being watched, it all clicked. The man I had seen wasn't real, at least not in the way I thought. I didn't know what he was, but I knew one thing. I would never, ever pick up a hitchhiker again.
Next story.
It was late one Friday night when I had to drive out to a remote town for work. It had been a long week, and I was exhausted, but I needed to get this assignment done. The town, Riverview, was tucked away in the hills, far off from the beaten path. The only way to get there was down a narrow, winding road that disappeared into the darkness. No cell service, no gas stations, just me and the road stretching ahead. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, it was somewhat comforting to me. The silence, the emptiness of the road, it gave me time to think, to breathe. But that night, something was different. I remember driving through the outskirts of the town. Everything was still. I didn't see any lights flickering in the windows or any signs of life in the town center. The buildings were old, some abandoned. It felt like something was missing, like the place was stuck in time. The feeling made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. After all, it was late, and I was just tired. I parked at the old gas station that looked like it hadn't been in service for decades. The building was run down, the pumps rusted, and there was an eerie stillness to the place. I got out of the car and stretched my legs, trying to shake off the discomfort creeping up my spine. I had a few hours of work to do, and then I'd head back home. Easy enough, right? As I turned to walk toward the nearby diner, a tiny, barely visible place nestled between two other abandoned buildings, I noticed a figure standing in front of the gas station. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I focused, I realized it was a person. A man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. A long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. For a moment, I considered ignoring him. Maybe he was just another traveler passing through. But something about his stillness made me uneasy. I took a few cautious steps toward him. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty night. "Are you all right?" No response. The man didn't move a muscle. I hesitated. Should I approach him? Or was this some kind of joke? Before I could make a decision, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. It was a woman walking slowly toward me. She was wearing a faded floral dress, and her long hair was tied back loosely. Her expression was blank, like she was in a daze. She didn't seem to notice me at all as she walked past me and toward the man. I watched, confused and unsure of what to do. The woman stood beside the man, but neither of them spoke. It was like they were waiting for something. I could feel the air growing heavier, as if the town itself were holding its breath. My instincts told me to leave, but something made me stay. The woman turned slowly, her eyes locking with mine. Her stare was cold, distant, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. And then, without a word, they both turned and began walking in the direction of the diner, their steps synchronized, almost mechanical. It was as though they had practiced this, rehearsed it. I wanted to follow, to find out what they were doing, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something in the pit of my stomach told me to stay put, that I was better off not knowing. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. But then the woman stopped. She turned her head slowly, as if she had heard my thoughts, as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. And she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was wide, unnatural, as if she were forcing it, as if the smile was a mask, hiding something far darker underneath. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Before I could react, the man turned to face her, and the two of them began walking back toward me, their movements too fluid, too coordinated. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I sprinted back to my car, my breath coming in short gasps. As I fumbled for my keys, I looked up, just for a second, to see the man and the woman standing on the side of the road, watching me. Their eyes locked with mine, and the expression on their faces, it was like they knew something I didn't, something I wasn't supposed to know. I didn't wait any longer. I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I sped down the road, my rearview mirror showed nothing but the endless stretch of empty highway behind me. The strange thing was, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me. Not physically, but somehow. I couldn't get their faces out of my mind. Their cold, emotionless stares, their synchronized movements, and that smile, the one that was far too wide. By the time I reached the main road and left Riverview behind, I thought I could breathe again. The tension in my chest finally loosened, and the air felt clearer. But when I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, I saw it. In the reflection, standing on the side of the road, was the woman, and the man was there too. I looked back quickly, but there was nothing there. No sign of them. The road was empty. I didn't stop driving until I reached home, and I didn't look back. I didn't want to think about what I had seen. I didn't want to know who those people were or what they wanted. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but wonder, what if they weren't just waiting for someone? What if they were waiting for me? The next day, I tried to forget about the town. I convinced myself that it was just a strange encounter, a trick of the mind. But something about it didn't sit right. I kept thinking back to the way the woman smiled. That smile, it lingered in my memory like a stain that wouldn't wash away. A week passed, and I thought I was finally moving on. But then I received a call from the town of Riverview. They had found me listed as the last visitor to their diner. The strange thing, the diner had been abandoned for years. No one had been inside for decades. Yet somehow, my name was on the log. And that's when it hit me. The woman, the man, and the strange synchronicity of their movements. They weren't just waiting for me, they were waiting for someone to come back.